I believe that the Word of God comes to us in three different guises. It comes in the great scriptural traditions of the world, what are sometimes called the peoples of the book. So we find it in the Tanakh of the Hebrews, we find it in the New Testament of the Christians, we find it in the Quran of the Muslims, we find it in the Upanishads of Hinduism, we find it in the Pitakas of Buddhism, and so we find it in the written scriptural traditions of the world. That's the first way. The second way, I believe, is we find the Word of God revealed just as powerfully in the great mythologies and folklores of the world. These oral traditions, some of which were actually never written down. That's the second way in which God's Word is revealed to us. And the third way, and possibly the most powerful of all, the Word of God is revealed to us through nature. Nature is perhaps our greatest teacher of all. But I want to just focus for a few moments on the second piece, the folklore mythology piece, because it's been my experience that the folklore or the mythology of a civilization is the archived wisdom of the group. So if you really want to go to the core wisdom of any nation, search in their mythology and their folklore, and you'll find it there. But then there are cliff notes. There's a cheat sheet. If you want to do it really, really quickly, you don't have time to read or to kind of familiarize yourself with all the folklore of a culture, just go to the Proverbs. The Proverbs are the distillation of the stories which are the archived wisdom of the group. So you find in the Proverbs the distillation of the wisdom of a culture. So as I've said to you a few times before, in my junior year, just as junior high school year was finishing and I was about to transition into my senior year of high school, I spent the entire summer holidays, the entire vacation, in a part of Ireland where Irish is still the spoken language. Now, I was raised bilingually anyway. All of my education was through Gaelic. But I was fascinated with the folklore of Ireland because my grandfather was a great storyteller, Shanachai. And so I spent the entire summer of 1963 in an area in West Cork called Coolay. And I spent the time visiting all the old people in the village. And I was asking them to tell me some proverbs. In Irish, the word for it in Irish is shanachal. And shanachal literally means ancient words. So I was asking them to teach me the shanachal. And I would ask them to give me a shanachal and then tell me kind of the background to it and the context in which it would be used. And over the course of the summer, I collected 432 of them, which was printed in a little booklet in the school a little bit later. But one of the things I learned was that one old man said to me at one stage, he said, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. And he was absolutely right, because the Proverbs are the distillation of the archived wisdom of the culture of the Celts, and so there's the Word of God revealed through that. But a second thing I found out then and later, as I had the privilege of learning several different languages in Kenya, every language I ever learned, I discovered very quickly that Proverbs are paradoxical. There are always Proverbs that contradict other Proverbs. And we have this in every language. In English we say, he who hesitates is lost, but look before you leap. In Irish we have stuff like, we'll say, Ní lein tín son mar de hint son féin. There is no fireside like your own fireside. But we will also say, Bíon blas ar chud an chorsan. There's a special taste to the neighbour's food. And so in every language, they're paradoxical, because truth itself is paradoxical. And that's what I want to suggest. The theme of my homily this morning is going to be this. I want to propose a paradox about the death of Jesus. And I'm just going to make 2 points. There'll be 2 poles to the paradox. And the first pole will be this. I will make the claim that the death of Jesus has absolutely no saving significance. And the second pole of the paradox, I will make the claim that the death of Jesus has enormous saving significance. So bear with me as I wrestle with these 2 poles of the paradox. So what do I mean when I say that the death of Jesus has no saving significance? I do not believe that it was an integral part of Jesus' lifetime that he had to die in the manner in which he died, and that otherwise it wouldn't have worked. I think that if Jesus had lived to be 80 years of age, like the Buddha did, or if Jesus had grandchildren like Lao Tzu did, his life would be no less salvific. That it wasn't the manner of his death, it was rather the way in which he committed radically and utterly to his purpose. That having agreed to come in and to live in total alignment with love, he lived every moment of his life in this total alignment with love. That he came in basically, and he said of his own purpose and his own mission, he said, I've come to preach good news and to give healing to the sick. Now, the healing wasn't just that he was curing leprosy or blindness. The healing was he was wrestling with the religious dogma of his day. He was trying to heal a theology which was based on legalism and or asceticism and move it into compassion and to love. He was wrestling with the illness of the economic models of his time, the totally unjust system in which he lived. He was wrestling with the political systems of the time. He was wrestling with the stratification of society where you had slaves at the bottom of it, and then slightly above that you had children, and then slightly above that you had women, and then slightly above that you had the plebs, and then you had some kind of aristocracy, and then you had the emperor, this stratified society. So the illness that he saw and was attempting to heal wasn't just physiological blindness. It was all levels of injustice as being perpetrated in our religious models, our economic models, our political systems, and our stratification. And the good news that he came to bring was that God was not a distant, demanding deity, a micromanager who created laws and punished them viciously. That God was Abba, or in Aramaic, which was the language he would have been preaching in, Awon. And Awon literally is translated as birthing principle of the cosmos. And so in some senses, he's talking about a God, Father, Mother God. It's not gender specific, a source which is the origin of everything that exists, and that God pours himself out through our creation, that the transcendent, ineffable mystery of God is seen through nature and all its artifacts, which is why nature is such a great teacher for us. So I find it very, very difficult to subscribe to the Christian notion of redemption. The word redemption in Latin literally means to buy back. And here's the kind of the thinking behind it, and I'm going to exaggerate it just for purposes of making it more obvious what I mean. And so the notion of redemption somehow is this story that's been embedded both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures, that there was a first mistake committed by our first parents, Adam and Eve. And God was so outraged at this disobedience that he banished them from the garden. Now, I've used this example before. It doesn't make any sense to me that God, the source of all that is, has created these two beings, Adam and Eve. They're childlike creatures. They cannot distinguish between right and wrong. They don't have the faculty of reason at this stage. And he gives them a whole bunch of possibilities, all kinds of resources. But he says, there are two trees in the garden you're not allowed to eat of. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. You can eat anything else you want, but not these two. It would be the equivalent of parents saying to 2 3-year-old kids, there's cabbage in the house, there's carrots in the house, there's broccoli in the house, there's potatoes in the house, and there's a cookie jar up there, and there's candy jar up there. You're not allowed to eat the cookies or the candies, but you can eat all the cabbage you want. And the parents go out for some reason, and they come back, and the kids are eating the cookies. And the parents come, and they get the kids, and they pack little knapsacks for them, and they send them and say, don't ever come back to this house again. You're never welcome. And if by any chance you get married and have kids of your own, they're not welcome either. And if even you have grandkids, we don't want to see them. I mean, that's the equivalent of it. How these innocent creatures, who could not distinguish between right and wrong until they'd actually eaten the forbidden fruit, could be held accountable for the mistake of eating cookies because the cookies looked really, really good and tasted even better. And so what we're asked to believe is that God packed their bags for them, 2 little kids, and sent them out into the world and said, that's it, I don't want to see you guys anymore. Or any kids that you might have, or grandkids that you might have. And so now who do they belong to? They belong to the world. They belong to Satan, the one who tempted them to eat the fruit. So now they belong to Satan. So after a few years, God, like some kind of an alcoholic who has abused the children during a fit of drinking, now comes to his senses and realizes, I can't believe what I just did. So I need to do something. I need to make it up to them. So now he wants to get them back. But now they belong to Satan, or the world. So he has to make a contract with Satan. And Satan drives a real hard bargain. Satan says, I'll give them back to you. Yeah, but here's the conditions. I need to be able to punish somebody. I need to be able to punish you. And in order for me to punish you, you have to agree to incarnate. And I'm going to tempt you, and I'm going to torture you, and I'm going to kill you. And when I'm satisfied, you can have them back. And God sits down, has a meeting with himself, and figures out, what are we going to do here? So there's 3 persons. There's, the Holy Spirit, and the Father, and the Son. And they say, one of us is going to have to incarnate in order for this plan to kind of go through. Any volunteers? everybody was silent. And finally, they vote, and the second person of the Blessed Trinity is going to have to incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, and he's going to be tempted, and he's going to be tortured, and he's going to be killed on a cross. And then Satan will be satisfied, and he'll give the rest of us back to God. Now, do we look like we've been given back to God? When you look at our world right now, does it look like we're all back in paradise behaving with love? So that notion that this was a contract, and that's what redemption means, that God had to buy us back. And the belief system that somehow the death of Jesus was the necessary modality through which this would be accomplished. Satan would settle for nothing less than the tempting, the torturing, and the crucifixion of an incarnated version of God. And then he'd be satisfied. So that notion of redemption doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. It is total anthropomorphism. And that's what I mean when I say the death of Jesus has no saving significance. As if we were to believe that somehow this was the necessary methodology by which Satan would agree to give back to an alcoholic divinity what he'd thrown away in a fit of drinking. That's what I mean by the first point. So the second point then, the paradox, the other pole of the paradox, in which I'm claiming that the death of Jesus had enormous saving potential. So what do I mean by this piece? So I want to look at, I've used this example with you before. In 1984, when I was still living in Kenya, I got typhoid. I thought I had malaria. I was treating myself for malaria. I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker, living in a very remote area and losing weight enormously and getting worse and worse and worse. And by happenstance, another missionary visited, and I was yanked out there, taken to hospital in a place called Eldama Ravine, spent several weeks there, and then I was airlifted back to Ireland for 3 months to recover fully from it. Now, the people among whom I lived, the Kalenjin people, when they got typhoid, they died because they didn't have the resources to get yanked out and airlifted to Ireland, to get really great medical attention. Now, that for me became a great metaphor for the difference between Jesus as an avatar and some of the other great avatars that have intersected with human life. There are many stories of avatars who intersected temporarily and for temporary purposes took on physicality. And then, once they'd accomplished their purpose, went back up. But Jesus totally signed up for a full human experience, all the way from conception through death, never eschewing any part of this process. So for me, it became, even right up to the very end, even when he was finally tempted before he died in Gethsemane, when he was aware just of just how bad things were going to get over the next 24 hours. And he was said to the Father, if it's possible, let this chalice pass from me. Is there some other way we can do this instead of me going through with this? But I finally said, no, I've signed up to experience the human condition. I'm going to see it right through to the end. And he did, even on the cross the next day. So in some senses, there was this radical commitment to experiencing the human condition so that he could heal it from the inside out. Not just through his preaching, but through the lived example of somebody who lives in utter alignment constantly with the will of God. And we see this throughout. We see it in the little 12-year-old boy who was in the temple arguing with the priests and the scholars. We see it in the compassionate healer who's reaching out to the blind and the crippled and the lame and feeding those who have no food. We see it in his lifestyle. And most powerfully, we see it in the last several hours of his life. And that's what I mean then by saying his death then has extraordinary saving significance. So I want to step through the dying process of Jesus. So I'm recapping a homily I gave last year, but it's of such importance to me because it orchestrates what this week is going to look like liturgically and psychologically and sociologically and cosmically. So when you search the 4 gospel accounts, there are allegedly 7 last words of Jesus. Some of them found in some of the gospels, others found other of the gospels, and they give very, very different impressions. So what I want to do again this morning is I want to lift out those 7 statements, and I want to reorganize them in the chronology of the evolution of compassion. And it'll be obvious what I mean by this in a few moments. So instead of giving them in the kind of the chronology in which they appear in the Gospels, I want to create a different order, showing that the very dying process of Jesus was also, it was like a fractal of his living. It was like a fractal, in fact, of the evolution of spirituality on our planet. Those last 3 hours on the cross were a fractal of the way he'd lived his entire 33 years, and in fact a fractal of the entire evolutionary trajectory of life on this planet and the evolution of spirituality on this planet. And so I want to start with a homeopathic metaphor. Homeopathy, which is a system of medicine devised by a great German scholar, Samuel Hahnemann, had the belief system that just like a baby develops in utero, cephalocaudally and proximo-distally, that is how healing happens as well. So when a little zygote is developing in the womb of a mother, it develops what's called cephalocaudally. It begins with the brain, and then it begins to develop downwards along the spinal column, and it develops from the interior to the exterior, proximo-distally, from the central nervous system out to the extremities, the hands and the legs. And that's how embryology develops. Now, Hahnemann believed that that is how healing happens as well. It develops cephalocaudally and proximo-distally, whereas illness goes in the exact opposite direction. Illness always begins at the outside and works its way in. So we first develop physical symptomology. And if the treatment of this is to repress the symptoms, it'll try to break out as another physical symptom. If we keep repressing the physical symptoms, finally it has to go inside and it will come out as emotional symptomology. Now, if you treat that by repressing the symptoms, the emotional symptoms, finally the illness has no place to go except into the psyche, deep into the psyche, into our mental life and our spiritual life. So we're driving the illness deeper and deeper and deeper very often by just repressing symptomology. Healing happens in the opposite direction. Well, so when somebody is significantly ill and they're being treated homeopathically, what you begin to see is, first, there'll be a manifestation of the psychological issues involved, and it'll appear like they're getting worse for a period. They're working their way out of the system, and then there'll be emotional symptoms after that, and then finally there'll be physical symptoms as the illness is working its way out of the system. Now, that's what I see happening in Jesus on the cross in the first stages. So the first statement he makes, and it comes from Mark's Gospel, where he cries out in agony, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? So it's the angst. It is the illness that has gone to the core of his being, to the depths of his own psyche, almost to his soul. This feeling that he'd been seduced by God, that it was a total hoax, and he lived his entire life in alignment with this mission, only to find out that God had abandoned him at the last moment. He's not just quoting Psalm 22, as some people would claim. This is the experience he's having at that moment of this radical existential pain through which he's going. And he gives voice to it. That's exactly what he's experiencing. So that's the deepest, deepest, deepest part of the illness of his crucifixion experience. Somehow he manages to break through that. And now it comes out to merely the physical extension of it. And so the next statement he'll make, and this will come from John's Gospel, I thirst. Now the I thirst is just a symbolic articulation of the extraordinary physical pain that crucifixion involved. Crucifixion was invented actually by the Persians and perfected by the Romans. And it was probably the most extraordinary form of human torture and death that could be imagined. And I'm not going to kind of upset you with the gruesome details of it, but probably the most vicious form of assassination that's ever been dreamed up by human beings. And so there's an extraordinary amount of physical pain that goes along with it. So the phrase, I thirst, is just symbolic of all the pain and all of the physical discomfort he's experiencing. And so that first phase, from those two phrases, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and I thirst, they represents Jesus' total self-preoccupation, because the suffering is so intense that he's forced into a self-preoccupation. But now he's going to break through that. And it's going to go from a psychological phenomenon to a sociological phenomenon. And now somehow, having managed to dig deep enough to overcome the existential angst and even the physiological discomfort of it, he now notices his mother and a group of his women disciples at a distance. They're being kept back from the cross. And suddenly it goes from self-preoccupation and compassion for himself to compassion for his family and for his friends. And so you find in John's Gospel, he's trying to make sure his mother's going to be taken care of when he's gone. So he nods to his beloved disciple John and he says, Son, behold your mother. And then to Mary, Mother, behold your son. In other words, look out for each other, guys. And it wasn't just the two, it wasn't just his mother and John. He's thinking about all his family, all his friends, all his disciples. He's trying to make sure somehow that they're taken care for, that somebody is exercising compassion for these. So now he's gone beyond merely his self-preoccupation and the compassion for self, which is very important, to compassion for loved ones. That's the next stage of it. And then as we read in today's gospel, at some stage he becomes aware of these two criminals who are being crucified beside him, and these people in this extraordinary agony as well. And one of them is shouting at him, "You're supposed to be the Messiah. Get down off the cross and save yourself and save us." And the other guy remonstrates with me, says, we're criminals, we're getting what we deserve. This man is totally innocent. He's done nothing to deserve this. And so he says, Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' response is, it's interesting the word he uses. He says, today you will be with me in paradise. Not at the end of the world, not after the last judgment, not after you spend your time in purgatory, but today. Because in God's dispensation where they're going, there is no time. Salvation or enlightenment is a matter of not temporal extension, but enlightened behavior. And so he said, I guarantee you, given the compassion that you have for me, you're going through the same suffering that I'm going through, and somehow you're aware of my suffering and you're having compassion for me. I guarantee you that very act of extending yourself and being compassionate for me, that immediately creates an enlightenment experience for you. You're going to be with me today in paradise. So that's the next extension. The compassion now is not just for family and friends, it's for a total stranger. He'd never met this guy before. The next stage of the sociological extension is he becomes aware of the soldiery who are mocking him and casting lots for his garments. They do this every week. This is what they do for a living. They're just having fun, and they're going to get the spoils. Whatever he belonged now is theirs. And they're casting lots who gets what. And then the religious leaders are standing far off, and they're mocking him. You're supposed to be the Son of God. You claim that God was your Father. Let's see. If I come down from the cross now, and then we'll all believe in you. And Christ, looking at those, he extends his compassion even to those blind leaders and says to the Father, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. And it's not that he's asking God, the Father, to forgive them, because God cannot forgive. To forgive, you first have to hold a grudge and then subsequently let go of it. God is radically incapable of holding grudges against anybody. God never gets angry with anybody or holds any grudges against anybody. So this is symbolic. It is not Jesus saying to the Father, please forgive them. Rein in your rage against these people who are crucifying me. That's not what it's about. He's saying, I am forgiving. I'm digging deeper. And I know that at the stage of your evolution, this is all you're capable of doing. You're stuck in law and legislation and asceticism and control and power. That's all you know. And at some stage, you'll know better. You learn how to move from that place into a place of compassion and love. And so in the meantime, I offer you my compassion and my love. And so now he's gone full circle from the preoccupation with the necessity of compassion for the self, to compassion for his loved ones, to compassion for the strangers, to compassion for the enemy. And that'll bring him to the last two great statements. At some stage then he will say, it is accomplished. I've done what I signed up to do. In other words, my preconception incarnational contract has been fulfilled. There were a few shaky times when I almost abandoned it, like last night in the garden, and earlier, a few hours ago, when it really felt to me like I can't go through with it or as a hoax. And now I realized that this too was part of the experience. And so I've done everything that I signed up to do. I've crossed my T's and dotted my I's from my incarnational experience. So I've done what I've come to do. And the final utterance will be, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And this is not like Jesus saying, okay, I did my part of it, now I want to go back home and I want to kind of sit in a special throne and I want garlands on my hand and I want to be given the prizes of this. That's not what he was asking. He wasn't going back to sit side by side with the Father. He was going to dissolve not just his incarnation, he was going to dissolve his very sense of separate self. He was going to merge once more with Source. There would no longer be a Jesus Christ. There would no longer be a second person of the Blessed Trinity. There would only be God and Source. So into your hands I commend my spirit is I'm letting go of all sense of identification. I'm not identified with this body which is in pain. I'm I'm not identified with my psyche, which is an emotional roller coaster. I'm not identified with my mind. I'm not identified with my mission anymore. I'm not identified with incarnation anymore. I'm not identified even with my separate sense of soul. I'm letting go of all of that, and I'm just merging back into Source. And that for me is the real meaning of that final statement. And the conclusions I come to then is, what for us in 2016 might be some of the takeaway messages. What do we take from this week, this extraordinary, most powerful week in the evolution of human spirituality? So some of the lessons I suggest perhaps might be these. That just as Jesus' mission was about preaching good news and healing sickness, that's the mission of every one of us. And so can I kind of look at myself and ask myself, when I speak, whether it's an internal dialogue or it's an external conversation, am I preaching good news? As a result of what I'm telling myself in my interior mental dialogues and the result of the interactions I've had with other people, is it good news? Is what I'm telling myself, what I'm telling anybody else? Is it good news? Or is it just old hat? Is it words of anger or despair or anxiety or fear? Or are they words of love and compassion? Am I telling them myself? The stories I tell myself about the people who have hurt me, what kinds of stories am I making up? Are they loving stories, compassionate stories for those enemy figures? You know, when I dialogue with people, what's the nature of my conversation? Is it good news for them? Are they receiving it and hearing it as compassionate words? And when it's good news and healing, how healing am I in my relationships? And so how well am I living, whatever relationship I'm having, whether it's with a spouse or a sibling, you know, or a colleague or an animal? What is the nature of those relationships? Are they healing relationships? Do people come away from encounters with you feeling healed, seen, loved, or judged? So that would be a second lesson that I see. A third lesson may be to look then at this expansion of compassion and to look at the course of my own life and ask myself the question, you know, have I been compassionate to myself? Or have I been totally judgmental of myself? Is my self-image such that I'm constantly self-flagellating, that I never, you know, give myself a break? So is that who I am? And if I can get to a place where I can love myself because I identify the God inside in me, can I now begin to extend that out? Can I see the God in my family and my friends? And can I extend, in my relationships, can I extend compassion to those, no matter how frequently they may screw up? And can I extend compassion to the strangers, people whom I will never meet, but who have a need of compassion, whether it's financial assistance from the first world to the third world, or it's prayer for them, whatever, or volunteer work, whatever it is. How can I extend my compassion out to the stranger in my lifetime? And then, how can I extend my compassion to the enemy figures, whether they're personal enemies, or cultural enemies, or national enemies, or global enemies? Is it really compassion? When Christ said to Peter, put up your sword, was he just talking to Peter in the garden? Or was he talking to people who were sending drones across the world, killing innocent bystanders? Or was he talking to ISIS, people who were decapitating other people? To whom was he speaking when he talked about loving your enemies? Because certainly our international policies are anything except loving our enemies. That would be a takeaway message for me. And another one for me would be maybe this: at the end of each day, can I really say at the end of each day, it is accomplished? I've really tried to walk my talk. I've really tried to align with the purpose for which I came down. Can I say that to myself at the end of every day? Or am I going to look back at the day and say, I screwed up again and again and again, so I'm going to do better tomorrow? And finally, when I lay my head on my pillow every night, am I ready to be able to say to God at that stage, into your hands I commend my spirit?
So what I think I'm hearing you say is that today you've taken us beneath the words, even beneath the proverbs, into the distilled deep wisdom of the experience.
Brilliant. That's beautiful.
I just wanted to see if that's where...
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. You've totally nailed it, Patricia. It's below the level of words, it's below the level of concept, it's below the level of theory, it's into the experience itself. Because ultimately, every single one of us has mystical experiences. Every one of us does. But it depends then, how are we going to allow that to affect our living? How does it affect our conversations, our behavior, whatsoever? So we have to, unfortunately, try to create models. We have to use the intellect in order to try to create maps that allow us to navigate life. But we should never mistake the maps for the terrain. No matter how good the maps are, they are never the terrain. There is no substitute for the mystical experience itself. You're absolutely right. Underneath all the words, underneath all the stories, underneath all the proverbs is the experience, the mystical experience. And for me, that's what Christ was demonstrating par excellence in the last several hours of his life. It was the lived experience of the mystery in all its facets, the darkness and the pain and the enlightenment of it.
I was just thinking about mindfulness, because I've been practicing mindfulness, and you were talking about observing your thoughts and observing yourself, and just thinking about the non-judgmental nature of the practice and how it allows me to look at things that I don't want to look at. Otherwise, my instinct is to just, and I'm not really aware of it, I'm just starting to come into that awareness that I've been doing this,
Totally,
pushing stuff away.
totally.
So I was just thinking about that. And I don't know if you want to...
Sure.
You didn't use the word mindfulness in...
Yeah. That's a beautiful insight. That's what it is, because the essence of mindfulness, as you've understood at this stage, the essence of mindfulness is that you're in primary awareness. You're not identified with the objects of your awareness. You're identified with the awareness itself, not with the objects that come into view. And so the thing is that there's this extraordinary struggle in every physical life form. The struggle between two different kinds of intelligence. There's the intelligence, the native intelligence of an organism, and then there's the intelligence of the soul that incarnates and docks with that organism. And so every creature has the ability at self-replication, at self-nurturance, at self-protection, even if it's a cauliflower sitting in a field. It's able to nurture itself in the ground. It's able to protect itself from insects in various ways, and so it has the intelligence of procreation, self-protection, self-nurturance. So the essence of the intelligence of the organism is survival. But the essence of the intelligence of the soul is compassion and love and the fulfillment of mission. And they dock together. And they need each other. The soul could not have a human experience were it not for the intelligence of the organism. At the same time, the organism is a vehicle that needs to be, in some senses, controlled, or we have to go beyond the mere ego and survival issues, and that's the function of the soul, to persuade it to begin to let go sequentially of various kinds of self-identification. And so the mindfulness is where you're trying to move completely into contentless consciousness, where the awareness is just looking at the objects that are presented before it by its physical sensations, emotions, intellectual ideas, societal interactions, just observing those, but not identifying with any of them, and just watching how does the ego behave when it's confronted with these particular kind of contents. But the identification has to do with the awareness. So there's a beautiful term in Buddhism for this. They differentiate between what they call turiya and turiyatita. Turiya is the witnessing consciousness that realizes it is totally other to that which it's. And turiyatita is the agreement to be participant observer, to be both the witness and the participant. So to agree to incarnation and be a participant in the process which you're observing from another part of yourself. Yeah. Johanna and then Patrice. Johanna was first.
I was wondering, there's a term called the care of the soul.
Okay.
And is it that are we tending the soul, or is the soul tending us? I think, and so,
That's brilliant.
but it kind of goes back and forth.
That's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant insight. Brilliant insight. So it's absolutely both. The care of the soul is the care that the soul extends to the incarnational experience, and it's the care that the body and the ego extend to the soul. They need each other. They're partners in this dance. Yeah, you can't do this dance on your own. The soul, left to its own devices, it's continuing to evolve in the bardo state. But its ability to make progress is slowed down by the fact that, it has cosmic intelligence. So if by limiting itself, you develop all capacities. It's a little bit like you take, say, a long-distance runner who goes out in the morning, and instead of running on a track, he decides to run on a beach where there's a lot of give in the sand. And at some stage, he's going to put weights on his feet, and that makes it really, really, really hard. And so by limiting, his abilities, when it gets to the actual race and it's not on sand and he doesn't have weights on his feet, he goes there like a bat out of hell. So it's by limiting ourselves that we develop capacities which otherwise would be developed much, much more slowly. So in some senses, the soul needs the body in order to make that kind of progress. But the body needs to kind of protect the soul in the sense that, it has to live in such a way that it opens itself up to the insights that the soul will bestow on it, so that I don't just identify with my ideas, or I just don't identify with my emotions, or with the job I do, or the relationships of which I'm a part. So there is this dance. The care goes both ways. It's a loop system between the two. Patrice was next.
Sean, I don't have a question.
Okay.
It was just a beautiful, beautiful sermon and teaching, and I wanted to say thank you.
Thanks a million, Patrice. Thanks a million. Thank you. Patricia.
I also want to thank you for that beautiful way of looking at the crucifixion. I always loved the meditations on the last words of Christ, and I didn't I didn't realize the progression, the way you explained it, and then how we can then apply that to our own experience, not in general, but actually day by day. And so I think that that's going to help me in my day-to-day, because I have the whole new appreciation of the progression of what Jesus said on the cross, and also a greater appreciation of what homeopathy does. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Patricia. And so I would like to invite you as well. You know that Good Friday every year, for me, is the most powerful liturgy of our liturgical calendar. And it's when members of the community take these 7 last words and work them from their own experiences and the difficulties of their own life. So it's from 12 noon to 3 on Friday, and you're going to hear God speaking through a whole bunch of other people in that process. Evelyn, Bill, and then Evelyn.
Yeah, I'm just curious, and I realize this may be a whole other sermon, but at what point in church history did this idea get started that the crucifixion was payment for sin and you had to sort of hitch your wagon to Jesus or you'd be lost?
Right. That's a great question, Bill. At what stage did this notion that the crucifixion of Jesus was the way to salvation and we had to hitch our wagons to that? It starts really, really early. You get it in the Gospels straight off the bat. And you certainly get it in the theology of Paul. This notion that crucifixion was, a very necessary part of this. So for whatever reason, it comes very, very, very quickly into the kind of the Jesus story. Now, I think that perhaps, at that stage, we're like children. We're only ready for grade 1 mathematics, theologically speaking. And that was the kind of the simplest and the most kind of startling and kind of productive, interpretation of the very, very complex life of this avatar. And maybe that's all we were capable of comprehending at some stage. The pity is that we've been tied to this understanding for 2,000 years, in spite of the fact that so many different mystics, have given us different versions. People like Meister Eckhart, who would say, of what use is it to me that my Saviour was born of a virgin 1,400 years ago? If he's not born again in my time, in my life, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God. And so this invitation to a mystical connection with Source, rather than some kind of a belief system that there's one person who's done it for us and we don't need to do it, we just need to kind of put him up on a pedestal and worship him. Jesus never asked to be worshipped. That's a twisting of his teaching. He will say again and again and again, even in John's Gospel, on the last day of his life, in John chapter 12, he will say, the very same things you see me do, you will do, and even greater. Because, once you align yourself with your inner divinity and you realize the divinity of everybody else, you have all these. Compassion is the most creative force in the universe. Compassion creates galaxies and universes, literally creates them. And so when you move totally from that position, you create a totally different form of reality. and you don't need, people doing it for you then. You may need training wheels when you're a 3-year-old and you're learning to ride a bicycle. But if you're still using training wheels when you're 17, there's something wrong. So religion is meant to be the training wheels of spirituality, where we substitute, belief in other people's experiences of God, which is religion, for dependence upon our own experiences of God, which is mysticism. Yeah. Evelyn, you had your hand up.
Oh, I'm thinking about the people who somehow found themselves on the wrong side of a story.
Okay.
I mean, if they did not exist, there would not be any story.
Okay, great point. Great point.
And then, but what happened to them? They have, in their whole life, maybe have tried, but did not succeed. I believe to wrong thing. I mean, Herod and all the Judas, they probably think they were doing good, but they were not.
Absolutely.
But that's because we think they don't now, but for themselves. So what happened to them?
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So let me use an image first, a metaphor, and then address that straight on. One of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not an expert in business in any way, but one of the things I've noticed over the course of my lifetime is that corporations or business people thought they were successful if over the course of several years they generated some profit for the group. Then it became, at the end of each year, you had to be able to show profitability for the year, otherwise you were in trouble. And then it became quarterly. If you're not showing profits for the quarter, no matter how well you did the quarter before or the quarter before that, if you didn't succeed this quarter, you're in trouble and we're going to fire the CEO. And so our attention span is getting shorter and shorter, and you've got to be profitable all the time in order to be successful. You're not allowed any failures, even if in the course, the long-term trajectory, the graph is actually rising. As soon as there's a little dip, you're out and you're fired. Now, that's why I believe so strongly in the notion of reincarnation. And so Herod got it really, really badly wrong. And the religious authorities got it really badly wrong. And so, but that was one little split moment in their eternal existence. These people have incarnated again and again and again. And they've got other opportunities for learning that the only thing that works is love. That whenever you act out of prejudice or anger or anxiety, poor results follow. So by trial and error, we learn, by doing the lesson frequently enough, that the only thing that works is love. So Herod has been back many, many times. I told you the story one time of my interpretation of the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You find in the gospel story where there's a beggar called Lazarus who's dying of sores outside a rich man's gate, and the dogs are licking his sores, and all he would want was some crumbs from the rich man's table, and the rich man won't give it to him. And then the rich man dies, and he's taken down to Hades. He's got a proper burial, but he's taken down to Hades. And the poor man Lazarus dies, and he's taken up to heaven. And again, the original version of the story is, he's up in heaven, he's going, na, 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 no one. That's not the meaning of it at all. That this was an opportunity for this soul to think, how did I live my lifetime? And you watch the progress. Firstly, he says, can you send Lazarus down and just dip his finger in water and touch my tongue, because I'm boiling in this place? And allegedly God says, no, you can't do it. Nobody's allowed to go from up here down there. You had your chance, you blew it to a flock. And the guy thinks, well, he says, if he can't help me, I have 5 brothers who are still alive. Can Lazarus just go and tell them, just warn them, so they don't wind up here? And again, God allegedly says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. And the man says, well, I know, but if somebody came back from the dead, then they'd believe. And allegedly God says, even if somebody comes back from the dead, they wouldn't believe. So God has been this real hard-ass bargainer, and the end of the story in the gospel is that the guy stays in hell. I tell you a different version of that story. At some stage, this man down there said, you know what I would like to do? All these animals, these wild dogs that were around my place and were literally licking the sores on this poor man. Can I go back and can I feed the dogs, look after the dogs, rescue the dogs? And God says finally, bingo, I was waiting for you to extend your compassion just beyond self-interest or interest in family to interest of others. Yeah, you got another chance to do it. You're out, go for it. And I believe that rich man reincarnated. And his name is? Saint Francis of Assisi. And he spent his time loving animals. And he became a Christ character. He got the opportunity to undo the damage he'd done in a previous incarnation and to learn from it. Herod got the same opportunity. Pilate gets the same opportunity. You and I get the same opportunity. We'll get as many chances as we need until finally every single one of us realizes that the only thing that works is love. And we know that then not just theoretically, but we know it because of the reactions that we create in our environment. So none of these people are in hell. Hell is a temporary state created by sociological or psychological factors. It's not an ontological reality created by the divinity. Yeah. Chris.
Yeah, hi. This is a little bit off topic maybe, but I'm really interested in one of the major deletions in the Bible. The 18 years from the time Jesus was 12 to 30 was removed. And there's an interesting book called The Jesus Mystery that I read years ago that touched on some of the information there. But I think I get a sense that that information is probably some of the most valuable of all the stories that happen with Jesus. And I think I have a sense that there was technology in there on how to evolve faster, Jesus talks a lot about love and forgiveness, but I don't get a take on how you do that. I think forgiveness is terrific. I'm just lousy at it.
But you're really good at humility, Chris.
So, anyway, I just want to know what your take was on the 18 years that were moved.
Sure. So it's interesting if you look at the 4 gospel accounts. The only 2 gospel accounts would actually talk about the infancy of Jesus, are Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel. And after the infancy stories are finished in Matthew, he skips right up to Jesus' public ministry. So he's going from age 1 to age 30. Luke has one incident in between. So Luke's gospel talks about the infancy, and he talks about an incident at age 12, and then he skips right up to his public ministry. John goes from Jesus' cosmic origins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He goes from Jesus' cosmic origins to his public ministry and doesn't say anything at all about his childhood. So that period in between, you could say it's 18 years or you could say it's 30 years, depending which gospel you're reading. There's no adherence to it, whatsoever. Now, are they deleting information about his life, or, what was their agenda? I personally believe that the Jewish tradition itself contained everything necessary to produce a Jesus. Just like the Irish tradition contains on its own everything that's necessary to become an enlightened being. Just as the kind of Nigerian experience contains everything it needs in order to create an avatar. If you know how to plumb the folklore of your own society, you can become fully enlightened without having to kind of cross-fertilize with others. It may have been possible that there was some dialogue between them. There's actually a great myth in Celtic mythology that Christianity reached Europe long before Jesus began his public ministry. That Joseph of Arimathea, that we mentioned in today's readings, was a great businessman who traveled widely, including to a place in England, a very mystical place in England called Glastonbury. Yeah. And that Joseph of Arimathea visited there regularly and took the boy Jesus with him on these journeys. And so that Jesus was exposed to the Celtic druids, of the time. So that's a story. There's a story that he visited Nepal, and there's evidence in some monasteries that there are books going back talking about a Saint Isa.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's what the book talked about.
Right.
Saint Isa.
Right, Saint Isa. There's evidence as well that Jesus may have visited Egypt and kind of gleaned a whole lot of esoteric knowledge there. And we certainly know from Matthew's Gospel that he spent some time there allegedly when Herod was trying to kill the child, and the father and mother had to flee and went down to Egypt and spend a few years in Egypt until Herod died. Now, is that symbolic of, an education, a part of his education that was given to him by the esoterica of Egypt? All these are possible. But the truth is that if you know how to look, you can look anywhere and find everything. If you don't know how to look, you can look everywhere and find nothing. So it's not so much important what his education was and where the education happened, but what mindset did he bring to his inquiry about life. And if that involved going to Glastonbury, spending time in Egypt, spending time in Tibet or Nepal, that's great. I have no problem with that. But I also think that given the extraordinary nature of this genius, that you could have put him in any context, in any civilization, any culture, and he would have looked at it in such a way that he would have bored to the core of its essential mystical wisdom, and from there he would have had enough ammunition to say what he said and do what he did. Yeah. Karen, how are we doing for time, Michael? Okay, so we'll let you have the last word, Karen.
I'm going to see if I can say this clearly. It seems to me, and part of what you just said, that we're each meant to be our own selves, that our following in the path of Jesus, we're not meant to be imitations of Jesus. We're meant to be, he's a way shower, but we're each meant to be unique in what we manifest.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a point at which the teaching, and I think that's what you're talking about, is you go, whether he went to Egypt or wherever, teaching gives you everything you need, but you then, it has to come from you as to who you're, how you're going to manifest
Absolutely.
that divinity.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, there's this bumper sticker you see, or t-shirts you see, what would Jesus do? Or what would Jesus say? They're very nice because they're reminders to wake up. But that's not your mission. You're not here to do what Jesus did or to say what Jesus said. You're here to do what you've come to do and to say what you've come to say. And you're in totally different circumstances, different period of human life, different culture completely. And so what you're being called to say and to do can be significantly different from what Jesus was called to say and to do. But it will always be driven by the same underlying principles: compassion and love and alignment with Source. Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for your patience. Namaste.